Good evening.
Good evening.
If anyone doesn't have a copy with you, Jacoen can give you a copy of the sutra. For people joining online, there on the website under the class announcement, there's a link to the first 5 chapters of the sutra, the translation that we're using. So I'd like to start out tonight just by reading this together. So we won't chant it, we'll just read it out loud together. And we won't read the titles of each of the chapters, we'll just read the text. The Diamond Sutra. This have I heard. Once the Bhagavan was dwelling near Shravasti in the Anatapatindada garden of Jeddah forest, together with the full assembly of 1,250 monks. One day before noon, the Bhagavan put on his patched robe, picked up his bowl, and entered the capital of Shravasti for offerings. After begging for food in the city and eating his meal of rice, he returned from his daily round in the afternoon. Putting his robe and his bowl away, he washed his feet and sat down on the seat set aside for him. After crossing his legs and adjusting his body, he turned his attention to what was before him. A number of monks then came up to where the Bhagavan was sitting. After touching their heads to his feet, they walked around him to the right 3 times and sat down to one side. On this occasion, the Venerable Subhuti was also present in the assembly. Rising from his seat, he uncovered one shoulder and touched his right knee to the ground. Pressing his palms together and bowing to the Buddha, he said, "It is rare, Bhagavan, most rare indeed, Sugata, how the Tathagata, the Arhan, the fully enlightened one, blesses bodhisattvas with the best of blessings. And it is rare, Bhagavan, how the Tathagata, the Arhan, the fully enlightened one, entrusts bodhisattvas with the greatest of trusts. Even so, Bhagavan, if a noble son or daughter should set forth on the bodhisattva path, how should they act? How should they practice? How should they control their thoughts?" The Buddha told the Venerable Subhuti, "Well said, Subhuti, well said. So it is, Subhuti. It is as you say. The Tathagata blesses the bodhisattvas with the best of blessings and entrusts the bodhisattvas with the greatest of trusts. You should therefore listen, Subhuti, and ponder this well. I shall tell you how someone who sets forth on the bodhisattva path should act, how they should practice, and how they should control their thoughts." The Venerable Subhuti answered, "May it be so, Bhagavan," and gave his full attention. The Buddha said to him, "Subhuti, those who would set forth on the bodhisattva path should think this thought. However many beings there are in whatever realms of being might exist, whether they are born from an egg or born from a womb, born from the water or born from the air, whether they have form or no form, whether they are able to perceive or not perceive, or neither perceive nor not perceive, in whatever conceivable realm of being one might conceive of beings, in the realm of unconditioned nirvana, I shall liberate them all. And though I thus liberate countless beings, not a single being is liberated. And how so, Subhuti, a bodhisattva to whom the conception of a being occurs cannot be called a bodhisattva. And why is that? Subhuti, no one can be called a bodhisattva who conceives of a being, a life, or a soul. Moreover, Subhuti, when a bodhisattva gives a gift, they should not be attached to an object. When they give a gift, they should not be attached to anything at all. They should not be attached to a sight when they give a gift, nor should they be attached to a sound, a smell, a taste, a thought, or a dharma when they give a gift. Subhuti, bodhisattvas should give a gift in this manner without being attached to any conception of its characteristics. And why is that? Subhuti, the body of merit of those bodhisattvas who give a gift without being attached, isn't easy to measure. What do you think, Subhuti? Is the space to the east easy to measure? Subhuti replied, no, it isn't, Bhagavan. The Buddha said, likewise, is the space to the south, to the west, to the north, in between, above, below, or in any of the 10 directions easy to measure? Subhuti replied, no, it isn't, Bhagavan. The Buddha said, in the same way, Subhuti, the body of merit of those bodhisattvas who give a gift without being attached isn't easy to measure. Thus, Subhuti, those who set forth on the bodhisattva path should give a gift without being attached to any conception of its characteristics. What do you think, Subhuti? Can the Tathagata be seen by means of the acquisition of attributes? Subhuti replied, no, Bhagavan, the Tathagata cannot be seen by means of the acquisition of attributes. And why not? Bhagavan, the Tathagata speaks of the acquisition of attributes as the acquisition of no attributes. The Buddha then told the Venerable Subhuti, since attributes are a fabrication, Subhuti, no attributes are no fabrication. Hence, by means of attributes that are no attributes, the Tathagata can indeed be seen.
So hopefully you're starting to feel some intimacy with these first 5 chapters of the Diamond Sutra. And the intention of this series of talks is an introduction to the Diamond Sutra. And as I said from the beginning, there's some conceptual work in that introduction, but as or more important than that conceptual work is the work of developing intimacy with the sutra, to receive the sutra and allow it to move through you and to become part of you. Actually, it already is part of you or is you, but to realize that more fully through receiving the sutra, through recitation, through copying, through repeated reading, so that the text becomes your mind, that your mind is forming this text. That's a way that the sutra can really become our long-term companion. And so I'm hoping that over this 6-week period, that this coming back and touching it again and again develops that familiarity. And then after that time, some of you may be reading the rest of the text, but we're concentrating on these first 5, that then the rest, the full 32 chapters of the Diamond Sutra can start to unfold from there. There's no hurry to try to consume these 32 chapters, which really can't be grasped. And so there's no sense in trying to procure them. It's just something that we meet and then are taught by, and we can continue to be taught by really for lifetimes. In the Zen schools in particular, the Diamond Sutra became the central teaching of the Zen schools by the time of the 6th ancestor, Daikan Enno Zenji. So he was the 6th ancestor in China. And probably earlier on, the major text that was used, it's reported that the text that Bodhidharma brought with him from India to China was the Lankavatara Sutra. But by the time of the 6th ancestor, the Diamond Sutra had become the central text and so formative for the Zen tradition. It doesn't mean the Diamond Sutra is all we should study, but it really forms a central core of the Zen teachings. And so That's why here at Buddha Eye we study it over and over again, along with the Heart Sutra and the Prajnaparamita in 8,000 lines. Those three Prajnaparamita texts are the ones that we use primarily. Over time, maybe we will study more. I hope so. So before I get into the presentation tonight, I'm curious if there's any questions from last week or people's studies over the last week. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's structured around the question.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is very clear.
Mm-hmm.
The answer is clear, but it's not what I would say linear.
Yeah.
Which is, I find interesting.
Yeah.
You know, there's a clear question that most people would say, oh yeah, I understand what's being asked.
Yeah.
And then the response is,
Yeah.
very paradoxical.
Yeah. So this is an invitation, Subhuti's question, we can understand Subhuti's his question in one way, which is the way of grasping after characteristics. So if we understand Subhuti's question to be, how should we practice? How should we control our minds? In some translations, how should I walk? How should we stand? How should we control our minds? What should we do? And it sounds like a question that is asking for a description of the characteristics of that practice. And then the Buddha invites Subhuti and the whole assembly and us into a different way of conceiving what practice is about. It's not the emulation of certain characteristics. It is not forming those characteristics and calling that practice and calling things that don't look like that not practiced. He's saying we have to come at it a different way. We want to discover the practice which is not bound by characteristics, but also has characteristics, or it shows up as characteristics. And so he's inviting him into a whole different way of considering what the practice would be, inviting us into that. And I think that's the real power of the way this sutra is lined out. That question comes at the beginning, and you can see, that's actually the question I ask. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to do this? And that's what we ask ourselves, that's what we ask our teachers, that's what we ask the world. And so often we're looking to grab after a definitive answer that is linear and can be defined and held on to. We can find the edges of it. But the Buddha isn't going to give that to Subhuti, nor to us. Yeah. And yet he shows up, as a being that can be seen and encountered, but can't be grasped. And that's his great, his great teaching. Anyone else? Mm-hmm.
My question has to do with translations.
Sure.
And so in this translation, and you've talked about in the first bit where it's describing the Buddha going to receive offerings and doing begging.
Yeah.
In other translations, two other translations that I noticed, that it's not just him. He's going with some of his disciples or part of his assembly. And I'm curious if that's, what is that when something like that happens in translation? Because in some ways it feels significant in this translation that he's on his own.
Right.
And then in listening to or reading the other versions, that's significant that he's going with his beloved disciples.
Yeah. So there's a couple things that can be going on there. As you were talking, I was just glancing down at the Chinese here. There's the two things that can be happening there. This particular part, I'd have to go look at the couple translations and see where they came from, etc., to be able to untangle that particular piece. But in general, two big things happen. One is there's different root texts. So, for example, if you're reading Kanza's translation, he uses a particular Sanskrit version. There are other Sanskrit versions that are used by other scholars of Sanskrit, and they can have slightly different wording. The text isn't exactly the same all the time. Then when you move to the Chinese, there is the standard Chinese, what became the standard Chinese version, but there are a few others. And so sometimes if someone's using a slightly different version, it can change. So that's one of the things that can happen. The other thing that happens is Chinese is, whereas Sanskrit is bizarrely specific. Like in English, you conjugate the verb mostly. In Sanskrit, you conjugate every word in the sentence. And every conjugation gives more specificity to what is being talked about. Exactly. I don't read Sanskrit, but the little bit I've walked into it is just like, it's unbelievable. Highly philosophical, very sophisticated philosophical language. But Chinese is just the opposite of that. Chinese is beautifully ambiguous. And the teachings that come through in the Chinese, there is a kind of, sometimes I will say, it's the specificity of ambiguity. And what I mean by that is things are purposely held as undefined. And in that undefinition, there's a rich invitation to interpretation and imagination and feeling that runs through the text. So a different person translating it will have a different feeling. So in the Chinese here, for example, my quick look tells me that there's no subject in the line that says that he went for alms. It doesn't say Buddha, nor does it say the Buddha and the assembly or anything, but the person translating that, because in English, we always have to have a subject in the sentence. How boring is that? You know, it's so tiresome, but we need it. We need it. And so when a person is translating, they have to make the choice. Was it the Buddha that went? Was it the Buddha and his disciples? Was it Buddha and, a box of Lucky Charms? We don't know. But the translator will make some interpretive piece there. And so always in interpretation, you're receiving something of the mind of the interpreter, which is why interpretation translation is so important. But also needs to be done by people who are really settled in the teaching and aren't just kind of dashing something off. This is, example of this is the Tao Te Ching. I'm sure that all of you are familiar with that, at least the title of it. That is the most translated book outside of the Bible, I believe. Anyone here, you could translate the Tao Te Ching if you wanted. You just take the characters and you put it into your computer, into the character lookup, and it will look up all the characters for you. And it's 4 character lines, and you could make some interpretation of what those meant, and your interpretation of the Tao Te Ching would come through. And so many people have done that. Even before there were computers, they looked it up in a dictionary. But it's so many interpretations can come out of it. And if you read anybody's translation of the Tao Te Ching, and then you look at the Chinese, you won't agree with them. You won't. Because there's so much has to come into that. So that's happening a lot in the text. Mm-hmm.
So in follow-up, in working with this, in the imagination, working with one translation, I have the image that he's going alone and what's happening, and then he comes back and he hears his assembly. And to hold that, and then on the other one, I have the image of him going surrounded, blah, 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 blah. So what I'm hearing you say, it doesn't matter, both of those can be held in working with this.
Which one do you like better?
There is no better.
Which one do you like better?
Well, I heard, before I read this, the one that I was listening to was that he was going amongst his disciples. And so that's the first one, and so that image I had first, and I liked that image.
Great.
But,
yeah. So I would say that's really the beauty of this. You can follow that image, you can follow that reading of it, and then as you become more intimate with the text, there may become a time where his singularity, or the translation that is his singularity, or when you become more familiar with the ambiguity of was he by himself or was he with other people while he was doing that might take on some significance for you. But we can wade in with the part that we resonates with us most. Like sounds like kind of a light word. Resonate sounds kind of deep. But basically, it's what we like, what makes sense to us. And the sutra has the capacity to meet us there, and then to draw us into deeper and deeper deeper and deeper meaning. And I think, we have a great gift now that also becomes a burden. And the gift is we have access to many translations, and we have access to primary texts in a way that no one ever has before us. Really, no, this is a very new thing that I could have, 7 different versions, 7 different translations, and 7 different primary texts that I could go to and find things up. I have a Sanskrit version that I look up certain words. I don't read the Sanskrit like as the sentence, but I can go find words and make sure that the Chinese is how it's relating to different words in the Sanskrit. No one's really been able to do that up until now with the ease that we can. So that's a great gift, but it's a burden because we can't just settle on one thing and go. So the way forward with that is to appreciate what our resonance is and step forward with it, but then keep open to continuing information. I was at Zen Mountain Monastery. This was maybe 8 or 10 years ago, and we were chanting in the morning. We chanted the standard version of the translation of the Harmony of Difference and Sameness and the Precious Mere Samadhi, and then Daido Lori Roshi, afterwards he was speaking with Akiba Roshi, and I was helping translate for Akiba Roshi. His English is pretty good, but sometimes he needs some help. And Daido Lori Roshi was saying, that translation's wrong. The front and back foot. How do we say it?
Back foot in walking.
But they're in opposition or something. They're like. Do we say that? Yeah, look it up. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Light and dark oppose one another.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you. Yeah, there we go. Thanks. Light and dark oppose one another. And he says, that's not right. It should be light. Their translation was light and dark harmonize with each other or stand together as one, or something. There was something kind of thing like that. And he was just flabbergasted that the word was opposition. And so he was saying, well, Akiba Roshi, why do you use that translation? And then Akiba Roshi was like, well, actually the character in Chinese is oppose. That's why we say oppose, because that's what it says in the Chinese. And it was really fun discussion. The translator of that had done their version had made an interpretive gesture there, because the opposition was not meant to mean that they conflict with each other. It was like an opposition of 2 feet. Like in a way, your right and left foot oppose each other, but they oppose each other for the purposes of allowing you to stand. And they balance off of each other. So the the translator had gone one direction, and then they had used that. But the image itself, the more literal translation is oppose. So we're always running into that kind of thing. And that was fun. Translating is not always fun, but that was fun. Yeah. Well, let me go into the a few remarks for tonight. And my intention, we have 3 more. And my intention tonight is to talk a bit about the 3rd and the 4th chapter, and then next week to talk more about the 5th, and then to come back to the 3rd and the final talk. Again, my intention here is not to overly explain things, but to try to open up some of what's in the sutra to invite you into a deeper relationship with it. Last week I was speaking about the body of merit. What in the translation that we're using is referred to as the hard to measure body of merit. And we can say that this body that is hard to measure, this is something that the Buddha knows. The Buddha knows the body as something that is hard to measure. And I was saying it's not that the Buddha knows that the body is hard to measure. It's not like a statement of knowledge, like a description of the body, that it's hard to measure. But the Buddha's practice is an awareness. And a deep awareness always reveals that things are hard to measure. It always reveals, or it is a process of enacting the hard to measure, the ungraspability of things. To meet things with a deep attention is not to define them, but is to meet their true face, which is not something that's behind their their apparent appearance, right? But the appearance itself is a very strange thing. But as our mind clamps down on it, what is a very strange and wondrous thing becomes something that we just call normal, or becomes matter of fact, or just becomes an object of our consciousness. Right? But this sutra is inviting us into a different way of being, a different way of seeing. Right? And so this body of merit that the Buddha is inviting us into is a body of merit because the Buddha knows the body as ungraspable, is seeing the body as ungraspable, is feeling the body as ungraspable. And so that merit body, that invitation to the merit body, is the answer to Subhuti's question. He says, you entrust us, right? You entrust us bodhisattvas. So how it is that should we live? How should we practice? And the Buddha says, well, please realize that you have this wondrous body of merit. You have this hard to measure body of merit. You are this hard to measure body of merit. So we can ask ourselves, what are the contents of this body of merit? Contents maybe is a little bit of a strange word because it's like an inside-outside. And this body of merit doesn't have an inside or an outside. It not having an inside or an outside is why it's a body of merit. But we could talk about what is it? What is that knowing as ungraspable? What is that attention which doesn't turn things into objects? This is what the Buddha is inviting Subhuti and us into. That liberated self and other. And this then becomes his instruction in this first part of the Diamond Sutra and then throughout the Diamond Sutra. And so in chapter 3 or in section 3, the Buddha gives this instruction about the correct source. If you notice, the title of that is the correct source of the great vehicle. And then in chapter 4, he gives this teaching about the wondrous practice. The wondrous practice of non-abiding. So notice that relationship. I'm going to talk about that a little bit tonight. The correct source, which is the wisdom teaching, the teaching that corresponds to ignorance. And then there's the practice of that wisdom teaching, which corresponds to compassion, corresponds to the medicine for greed and hate. So if we think of the three poisons of delusion and greed and hate, we always need the wisdom teaching, which corresponds to delusion. And we need the compassion teaching, which corresponding medicine for greed and hate. And it's not that these are separate. Actually, a wisdom teaching without a compassion teaching just becomes very abstract. And a compassion teaching without the wisdom teaching just becomes mired in the karma of samsara. They need each other for real liberation to happen. And so we find here in the Diamond Sutra that the Buddha answers with both of these sides. That's a core teaching that he gives. So after Subhuti's question, he encourages him. He says, however many beings there are in whatever realms of being might exist, whether they are born from an egg or born from a womb, born from the water or born from the air, whether they have form or no form, whether they are able to perceive or not perceive, or neither perceive nor not perceive, in whatever conceivable realm of being one might conceive of beings, in the realm of unconditioned nirvana, I shall liberate them all. This wondrous multiplicity, a wondrous actuality of multiplicity. That's the first thing that he points Subhuti to. He doesn't say, oh, forget about all of this world. It's a delusion. Control your thoughts by cutting off this delusion of the multiplicity of the world. He says, give rise to this thought. And then he gives this beautiful way of talking about any conceivable being. I particularly like this line where he says, whether they are able to perceive or not perceive, or neither perceive nor not perceive. Very thorough, right? You could think about this as we think, oh, what's sentient or not sentient? And we say, oh, well, things that are self-animate are sentient. Birds and people and shrimp and dogs, they all seem sentient because they move around and they react to sensations. But then you look at a tree and you say, oh, trees seem like they may have a sentience that I don't quite understand. And if you follow that out, you'll see like, oh, I don't really know what is sentient or not sentient. Actually, probably everything, whether it perceives or doesn't perceives, right? Or it doesn't not perceive, or doesn't not perceive. Actually, anything which I'm trying to define what is a being or not being is included. If my question is this one included in beings? If that's your question, the answer is yes, right? Anything. So that wondrous multiplicity and actuality of all beings, the Buddha, that's where he points Subhuti's mind. That is the thought. He says, think that thought. Let your mind be that shape, the shape of every possible being. It's quite powerful. Later on in the sutra, the Buddha talks about grains of sand a lot. There's also a lot of talk of filling the cosmos with jewels. These references to the specificity, to the multiplicity, those are really important. That's the first thing that the Buddha directs Subhuti to. But this shape of mind that includes all possible beings is a non-shape. And the reason it's a non-shape is because a shape, if we're creating a shape, right, we're attaching to the characteristics of that shape, we always have to leave something else out. That's how we recognize something, right? We say, oh, this is this because it's not that. But the Buddha is encouraging Subhuti to say, oh, it's also that. 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 Anything you could ask, if it's that, yes, it is included. So that mind of multiplicity is a shape which is a non-shape. It's a thought that is a no thought. It's not a rejection of thought, right? It's not a negation of thought, which the Buddha is presenting here, which is oftentimes the way we misunderstand it. We think, oh, Zen is about getting rid of thoughts, right? We have teaching about no mind, or sit meditation, right? And clear your mind. And we think that clear mind would be something where there's no thought. But actually, the Buddha's doing something else here. Dogen Zenji, the founder of this school in Japan, many years later, 1700 years later, said in one of his famous essays from the Shobo Genzo, called the needle point of Zazen, or the acupuncture needle of Zazen, he said, we should have the courage to think. We should have the courage to think. Is echoing this teaching of the Buddha here. But we have the courage to think, not thinking. A thinking which is not thinking. We don't just try to cut off thinking and make not thinking. We have a thinking which is so inclusive. The shape of our mind is so all-inclusive that we can't call it any inside or outside, like there is a thought or a shape. This is called non-conceiving. And so at the end of this chapter 3, he's saying, and though I thus liberate countless beings, not a single being is liberated. So he flips it over. Or that all-inclusiveness, that shape that is no shape, if we include everything, we come to see there's no liberation, there's not a being to be liberated. There's no being I can carve out from all the other beings to be liberated. In Thich Nhat Hanh's earlier commentaries on this, I don't know if it's in his new book or not. I'm sort of thinking it might be. He was much younger when he wrote that earlier one. And he has this really hilarious thing, some of you might read it, about, he says, I love to walk in the countryside. And one of the things I love about walking in the countryside is if I have to pee, I can just pee anywhere. And it's so free. And he says, but I have this problem. When I go and I think, oh, I'll just pee, and then I'm standing in front of a tree and I'm ready to pee, and I think, oh no, there's this being here, this tree. This is rude to pee in front of this tree. And so I go somewhere else, and then I think, oh, I'll pee here, there's no tree, but then there'll be a bush, or there'll be a flower, or there'll be something else, and I think, oh, this is not, and I love, see, if this didn't come from Thich Nhat Hanh, maybe it wouldn't be so funny, but it's so funny because he's like a saint, right? I mean, for him talking about peeing is just, I think it's hilarious. Anyway, and so in his commentary, he says, so this is like the conundrum of every being, right? Every being. And so he's saying, I'm there, and then I can't find anywhere to go to the bathroom. And he says, but then I realize actually all of these beings are there, and I'm also one of those beings, and my pee is also one of those beings. And so there's nothing rude about this. And then he says, so then I go back to the city, and I think, oh, I'll just go, pee the way I normally do. But then I realize, oh, that stinky wall, concrete wall at the station that I go pee on when I'm going to the train, it's also a being. And then I have to remember that all beings are included in this. I can't remember why I brought that up, just because I thought it was great. But that's kind of the process, So the non-conceiving, right? This liberating countless beings, and not a single being is liberated. The Buddha goes on to say, so Buddha, a bodhisattva to whom the conception of a being occurs cannot be called a bodhisattva. And why is that? Subhuti, no one can be called a bodhisattva who conceives of a being, a life, or a soul. So what is this non-conceiving? What does it mean to not conceive these beings as, or this life, or a soul? To both give rise to the thought of all possible beings, but to not conceive of a being. Maybe one way we can think about this is not buying in to the attitudes of selfing. Not buying into that attitude that as we encounter beings, we create this self and then that being. This is a normal way that we encounter beings, right? And these are the core teachings here within the self, the person, the being, the life. In our translation, the being, the life, or the soul. These are all different versions of how it is that we buy into that process of selfing, the process of there being, and this is the primary quality of ignorance, right? Is we think that there is some kind of abiding self. Right? The next chapter will be the wondrous practice of non-abiding. Right? But this teaching is teaching about the non-abiding, right? The wisdom aspect of non-abiding, not the practice of it, but the actuality of it. That there is no being abiding there. Right? And yet we buy into that abiding being again and again and again. We buy into it as a self, as a person, as a being, as a life, as a soul. And those are all different versions. I talked a little bit about last week of that buying into, relying on an attitude that self is the basic organizing principle of life. Hey.
It just occurred to me, this would be like really disturbing in Buddha's time relative to the caste system,
Mm-hmm.
which is the structure of the society.
Oh yeah.
So he'd be challenging that quite a bit.
Oh yeah, yeah. And in modern India, there is a big challenge to the caste system by Buddhism. There is a number of people in the lowest castes that are converting to Buddhism, much like they had converted to Islam before. And there's a movement, a Buddhist movement, to overturn the caste system. And there's non-Buddhist movements to overturn the caste system too. It's really changing in India now, I gather. I've never been there, but some of the reading I've done. Yeah. So we can take this teaching, and we can see, this teaching of non-conceiving, but actually we are totally addicted to the naive, natural, ignorant, delusive way of seeing the world, or the way of thinking. There's just no getting around it. I'm very sure that I am me, and I'm very sure that you are you. I don't mean in a general sense, but I mean in a very specific sense. The way I perceive, the way that I conceive of things, is so natural for me to do that. It's so natural for me when I am alive, that the appearance of anything in the world fits into the attributes with which I define it, and it becomes a kind of inert. We even make other beings inert, and so all of these objects of our perception, they simply become objects to this subject, and this is very hard to counter. We can't just say, oh, I've had the explanation, right? That's not there, and so I'll be over that now. I was just hearing last night from Rhonda McGee, who's a teacher in the mindfulness tradition, Spirit Rock tradition, and she visited a class that Myobun's been teaching at the temple on racial justice and mindfulness and Dharma work. And she was mentioning a book. I'm going to get a copy of this. I'm very interested in it, and some newer research by a scholar out of Stanford. I can't remember her name off the top of my head. And they're researching about the effects of knowing about racial prejudice. What are the effects on people's attitudes and activities? And what they're finding out is zero. Knowing the constructs of racial prejudice do not cure racial prejudice. They do not change the way that we behave. That's what they're finding. In fact, in many cases, they make it worse. This is not to say that we shouldn't learn about racial prejudice. I don't mean that at all. But what she was saying is that the point in that scholarship is to see that education is not enough. And we have known this ever since we tried to convince people to stop smoking. Right? We knew it before that, actually. But people say, oh, there's more education, more education. I mean, any problem that we have, we say, education and communication will solve it. But actually, as it turns out, that's not what solves it. What solves it is the inspiration to live in a different way. Right? Smoking, I'm not so concerned about. Subject-object, I'm concerned about. Right? Racial prejudice, I'm concerned about. Objectifying beings, I'm concerned about. In all of the ways that happens. So we have to give rise to an inspiration to live differently, because we automatically do that conceiving. Right? And that's why the Buddha is so rare, a being that can see completely in this different way. It's kind of unfathomable. We chant at the beginning of a talk that this wondrous Dharma is rarely met with even 100,000 million kalpas. Or we say years, but kalpa is even longer, right? It's because it's so rare to be introduced to be invited into the capacity to see in a different way. So this non-conceiving of a self, a person, a being, alive, this is the source, right? It's the source of the great vehicle, the correct source of the great vehicle, to know that every possible being. Every way we could conceive of a being, we have to include. And because we include every possible conception of a being, it means that we can't be conceiving of beings. The practice of conceiving of beings breaks down if you're going to include every possible conception of a being. But that can't happen in abstraction. And that's why the wisdom teaching has to have the compassion teaching. Because if we just take that teaching, it's very philosophical, and you can go to some very interesting places, right? I've been reading some interesting about, I can never say his name right, Goethe, German, Goethe, oh man, really interesting. No, I don't know any about that. I never read Western stuff. I was so into Asian thing, Asian philosophy and all that, and I went headlong. And it's so wonderful now to go back and learn about some of these brilliant figures in the West. Anyway, brilliant. And you can go Heidegger and all these kind of people, and you can just go off into wow. And I know that they must have struggled too with what is it to not just be in the abstraction. Right? The question is then, how do we live? And so the Buddha brings that. He says, with the wondrous practice of non-abiding, it's not enough to just know this or to be invited into the mind which does not conceive, but we have to practice that. And that practice side we can call compassion. In this case, the Buddha tells Subhuti to give a gift, which I believe is the supreme practice of compassion. It is the fountainhead of all practice, generosity. And if you ever feel like you don't know what that means, bear down on the generosity part. Forget about concentration, forget about patience, forget about all those things, and just come back to generosity, because it will, everything will bloom from there. And he says, give a gift. Give a gift going beyond the conception of characteristics. Now, this is a very interesting thing. This is why generosity is so powerful. Because if you give a gift, if you give a true gift, you have to go beyond the characteristics of yourself. Whatever that is that you believe is yours to give is already the conception. There's already an abiding self in that, right? For you to have a gift to give means that there's already a selfing. Because it's mine. So I could give it to you. It's brilliant. Because it says, yeah, of course we're ignorant. Of course we're acting through delusion. But we have an immediate access to a practice which goes beyond that. It doesn't destroy our perceptions, right? But it invites them. It invites our conception to become a conception of all beings. And in that conceiving of all beings, I can step across by giving that gift. Right? And that's all kinds of things. You know, we can think of a gift in a material sense, and that's maybe the most straightforward way, you know, for us to understand it and to be able to give a gift. But you think about the gift of attention. Just to even think that my attention is mine is a little bit strange. Like, if it's without there being something which the attention is given to, there's not even anything to call attention. It only becomes attention in the act of giving it. So, giving attention is just like this is the like very foundational practice of stepping beyond that sense of my own, abiding, this self. This week I was admiring these perfectly hewn holes in the ground right out there that Onyu dug last Friday. Just like, I wasn't sure if there were holes underneath all the little stones that you put down, because I was like, they're too small. And I opened it, they're just these perfect holes down into the ground. So what's that attention, when you're digging that hole? What is the gift of attention that happens in that whole dynamic process, of the earth and of the the post-hole diggers, of your body, the breath, everything that's present there, all the beings that are there present in that emergence of this whole.
Hey, Joe,
Mhm.
it just occurs to me how curious it is that we, at least in the US, we say pay attention
Yeah.
rather than give attention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, yeah. You gotta pay your dues here. Yeah.
It's a transactional relationship somehow, or,
And then we've got so wealthy with our attention that we can spend it watching
there
TV.
you go.
Yeah. Yeah. And now attention has become really the currency of the modern economy. How do I get someone's attention? Really is how we monetize things so much now. How our politics runs, how everything happens. So it's quite radical to free attention, to make attention a gift.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in your work, that's what it
Pretty
is.
much what I do.
Right, yeah. Anya's a chaplain at the hospital, for those of you who don't know. I mean,
Completely giving my attention, no matter what it is.
yeah. So, the question is, how do I give this gift without the conception? And the Buddha says, when they give a gift, they should not be attached to anything at all. They should not be attached to a sight when they give a gift, nor should they be attached to a sound, a smell, a taste, a thought, or a dharma when they give a gift. So even the way I've been talking about it, saying, like the feeling of it, right? In a way, even that we have to give away. We can't conceive of it as being in the sight or the sound or the smell or the taste or the thought, the feeling, right? Even that is a kind of holding on to the thing to make it mine. And so there's this encouragement to go beyond. That's always the teaching within the Prajnaparamita sutras, is going beyond. It doesn't mean to deny what is happening now. Actually, the sight, the sound, the smell, the taste, the touch, the feeling, the joy, the disappointment, all of the kind of things that might be there, those are not our enemies, right? They just are empty, which doesn't mean that they're unimportant. It just means that they are an invitation to go another step, to not abide in them. And the Buddha then says, I focused on this last week quite a bit. He says, further trying to explain, he says, how about this body? Is it easy to measure? No, it's not easy to measure. It's like space, right? Any of those feelings that we have, any of those sights, the sounds, the smells, the taste, the sense of the minus of it, the sense of the yourness of it, all of that is like space. And what it means to say that it's like space is not that we want to destroy it and make it like absent. It's to say that it itself is like space. We don't need to get any of those perceptions destroyed for there to be space there. But that those things are themselves spacious. That we don't need to dwell in them as me. I don't need to take them as the mark or the attributes of selfing. I can let them be free, which is also how I can be free. And so, how do I do this? Well, this is Subhuti's question, right? How do I do this? And the Buddha says, give rise to the thought. There's no secret meaning behind that. There's no summation of that teaching in which you get to sidestep the giving rise to the thought of all beings. You actually have to do that. The Buddha has told us how to do it. But we will ask ourselves again, okay, that's great. So how do I do it? How do I not do the thing you told me to do, but take the pill, right? That will make me be enlightened. Which is exactly not the point. We actually have to do that practice. And to do that, we change the way that we see. And this then becomes the teaching of true seeing, which is the fifth section, which I'll talk about more next week. But this principle and this practice are what the true seeing is about. So sticking with this very closely will lead into this next fold of the teaching. Anyone have any questions? Hi.
Let me try and form this into a
Mhm.
question. One can read the sutra. You have to sort of read it like a story.
Yeah.
Right? It sort of unfolds in time in a linear way.
Yeah.
Which in a way is that's fine.
Yeah.
But also I want to have a sense that there's kind of a universal kind of quality to the emergence of the text. But because my mind is human, I can read it in this sort of linear way. So I always, when I get to the third chapter, I notice how I'm trying to get to the flip very quickly, right? So it's like here's the give rise to a thought, but actually the thing that makes you a bodhisattva is the flip.
Right.
And then I think that can't be right,
Yeah.
So it's like you have to first give rise to the thought, and then, and it's very practical actually, right? That you have to give rise to this thought first, and thus, there. But then it's like, you can extend that in all directions in the sutra, right? So it's like, so Subhuti has to add, like I always think about where am I in this this trajectory of this interaction, right? Have I given rise to a thought yet? Have I? Am I at the end thus? Am I still at the part where I'm asking a question? Am I at the part where you have to venerate? There's this quality that emerges, which is like temporal. You have to like. It's important that the practice is presented in this specific order. For us to be able to interact with it in this way. And I wasn't able to form that into a question.
That's okay. Yeah. That's wonderful. Thank you. When we read this description of all beings, it's very natural for our mind to go into space. So we think about, right now, all of the beings that could be present, all of the beings in the universe. But there's another direction we can go, which is temporal. So we could say, this isn't just about all the beings that we could conceive of in this moment that could possibly be, but all beings throughout all time. So it's also going in that direction as well, or that plane is included. In fact, we say that a completely awakened Buddha sees both of those all as one thing. This is why, in the classical understanding, as soon as the arising of the bodhicitta in a being happens, the Buddha can see their Buddhahood. And so in many sutras, the Buddha will give a prediction of Buddhahood to someone. That's not because they see the future, it's because they see it all. And to the Buddha, a being's rising of bodhicitta and their Buddhahood is the same thing. It's like one body of their Buddha, of their Buddhahood. But bodhicitta is the one way that it shows up. So I think one of the reasons that is important is we do have to follow the teaching in this sequential way. But the reason that we follow it in a sequential way is not because we go through one part of the teaching and we leave it behind and go to the next part of the teaching. It's because the first part of the teaching is the next part of the teaching. And in its maturation, as the bodhicitta matures, as the life of the bodhisattva matures over countless lifetimes, whether we understand those lifetimes as being the moments of this life or of many, many rebirths, both interpretations are important, I think, that maturation is not going from one thing to the next. It is that fundamental teaching in that life coming to fruition. So that veneration of the Buddha and the beholding of the hard-to-measure body that just inspires us. I was talking with someone this week, and they're like, I just can't get past that first scene. I just keep seeing light shooting out of Subhuti's hands in front of the Buddha, and I can't read the rest of the text. And I was like, well, sounds pretty good to me. Yeah, I'll stick with that. Because that is this giving rise to the thought of all beings. And it's not that the flip, that's our mistake. We think there's a pivot point where all the stuff that leads to that point is then going to pivot us, as opposed to saying the veneration is the shape of the mind that is no shape, right? That shape of the mind that is no shape is there is no beings to be conceived. There's no life, there's no soul, there's no being to be conceived, which is the giving of a gift, right? Which is the hard to measure body, which is the seeing of the attributes and the non-attributes. All of those they're just like, the same thing over and over. This is also the core definition of skillful means, that the Buddha can offer a teaching that will meet us wherever we are. In fact, in some way, one way of understanding is the Buddha only ever says one thing. The Buddha says, ah. That's the shortest Prajnaparamita text, actually. It's called the Prajnaparamita in one letter. But we hear that Dharma according to the needs of our situation. Pretty cosmic, yeah. Sure.
Can you say something about, at least in my own experience, I'm just shocked how there are times where I'm kind of like working with these words, and then like a little gate opens.
Yeah.
And there's just a going through.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to cultivate what it feels like remembering. Mm-hmm. And it's like, how did I forget? Mm-hmm. And can you say something about that?
Yeah.
And oftentimes it's when you're speaking. It's really great when that can happen and a teacher can offer that to you. Yeah. But how can that? What is that? Do you have words for that?
Yeah.
And how is that cultivatable?
Yeah. Well, it's true cultivation, right? In fact, Kogen's name means profound cultivation, and that profound, the cultivating the profound. Ko is cultivate, and gen is profound. But profound means dark, or means unrefined, or means like unmanipulated. So if you think about the image of cultivating, if you have a shovel, or you have a mattock or a hoe, and you're cultivating the earth, that this earth is a dark thing. Not dark like evil, right? But like dark like I don't get to know. The grass shoots are coming up this morning. It was like a magic. Last night, no grass. I was watching really closely because I was very excited about it. It's been about a week since Dokyu and Joichi put the grass seed in, and Joichi's been watering it really diligently. And last night I was looking, there's nothing, And then all of a sudden, it's really magic. Like we think, oh, yeah, of course I put the seed on, and germination's about a week, and blah blah blah. It's like, come on, Like, okay, we have an explanation for it. But we're explaining magic to no end all the time. Oh yes, the earth goes around the sun, as if that was an explanation of the magic that we experience every day with the sun coming up and the moon and everything. So the cultivation of the profound, the cultivation of the dark, or the darkness of true cultivation, is the willingness to for that gateway to be a total surprise, and the moving through the gateway that doesn't lead you to understanding, but leads you to the total openness of true profundity. That's the gift that the world is giving us all the time. And when we put our effort into giving that true gift, we also receive that gift. If we give that our attention, then we receive that gift again and again. And we call it mindfulness or something, which I don't mean to bag on mindfulness so much, but I mean it's just too small of a conception of what we're doing. It's actually like magic. It's like mind-blowing beauty. And so that's where the cultivation can happen. And we don't need to look for, this goes back to what you were saying, Jacqueline. We don't need to look for the place that it flips over. That's the very thing that keeps us isolated from the actual flipping. Having said that, it's better to look for the place to flip over than to just, turn into a potato head. It's better to long for that than to try to snuff it out, But then we have to learn, actually we have to give ourselves, not receive the awakening. We give the attention, and then we can receive. And with the text, then that's why taking a smaller amount of the text like this and going over it again and again and again and again, and then making your own a deep relationship with it. These texts, it just happened to me again. I have my mind goes, and then there's 12 little images there. I'm going to try to bring it down. So you could read a text like this and you could say, oh, this isn't so hard to write. It's not so complicated, right? It's not so, it doesn't seem like such a thing. But this is always our mistake. If we look, I was eating a tomato for dinner, and you look, you look at tomato, and it's quite wondrous. But it's a tomato, right? You're like, oh yeah, people have been growing tomatoes forever. Yeah, they've been growing tomatoes forever. The tomato I have in my hand is a tomato that has come to me because it has been cultivated for a really, really long time. And the deliciousness and the texture and all the qualities of that tomato comes to me through the efforts of countless beings, not least of which is the tomatoes themselves, right? Which brings this tomato into my world. And the same thing happens with a text. Is we go, oh yeah, it's great, but it's pretty simple or whatever, and we don't realize this is ancient. And we can spend our whole life just with these 5 chapters and not really receive all of what has been honed through all of those years in the way that this has come to us, and all of the time that isn't even reflected in years that comes through the thing. So it has this capacity to open doors, and that's why we venerate. That's why before lunch we have the sutra with the Dishubun. This book that's here to the Prajnaparamita's left. This is a central Prajnaparamita text. That's why we fan it, we bow to it, we burn incense to it, because that quality of the sutra isn't present just in the reading of it, but it's present through all of that. So, some people are afraid of that kind of talk because it can become text worship. It can become kind of like dogmatic, but it's pretty hard pressed to someone to make dogma out of the Diamond Sutra. I think we're safe. I think we're safe. I think we're safe with that. I'm not. I mean, I'm sure someone could do it, but it has a way of undercutting that kind of approach.